For decades, the name Westinghouse meant electricity itself, not a household appliance and not a logo stamped on consumer products, but the invisible force that made modern life possible. Before electric light became ordinary, before factories ran through the night, before cities glowed after sunset, electricity was unpredictable and widely feared. Early systems sparked fires, caused fatal accidents, and failed without warning. Many cities hesitated to adopt it at all. Gas lighting felt safer, steam power felt familiar. Electricity felt experimental, unstable, and dangerous. Westinghouse entered that uncertainty with a different focus. The company was not chasing novelty or spectacle. It was focused on control, reliability, and scale. The goal was to turn electricity into something that could be trusted to run cities, industries, and transportation systems continuously without constant disaster. That goal required more than invention. It required factories capable of building machines large enough, precise enough, and durable enough to handle power at levels never attempted before. The factories that carried the Westinghouse name reflected that ambition immediately. They were vast industrial structures, often stretching across multiple city blocks, designed around machines so large they could not be moved once assembly began. Turbines, generators, transformers, and switchgear were built in place, sometimes over the course of months or even years. Overhead cranes ran the length of entire buildings, capable of lifting loads that weighed more than houses. Rail lines entered factory floors directly, allowing raw materials and finished equipment to move without interruption. Inside these buildings, everything revolved around sequence and timing. Large components were cast, machined, assembled, tested, disassembled, refined, and assembled again. A single turbine could pass through dozens of hands before it was finished. Engineers checked measurements repeatedly. Inspectors signed off at every stage. Delays were costly, and mistakes could be catastrophic. These were not buildings designed to change easily. They were designed around certainty. In cities like Pittsburgh, East Pittsburgh, Trafford, and Turtle Creek, Westinghouse factories became permanent landmarks. They dominated skylines and shaped neighborhoods. Streets, housing, schools, and businesses developed around factory schedules. When shift whistles blew, thousands of workers moved at once, and entire parts of the city followed that rhythm. Morning traffic flowed toward the plants. Evening traffic flowed away from them. Lunch counters filled and emptied on predictable schedules. Bars near the factories opened early and closed late. The city moved with the work. A job at Westinghouse carried real weight. It meant skilled labor rather than temporary work. It meant training that took years to complete, often through formal apprenticeships. Young workers learned to read blueprints, operate complex machinery, and understand electrical systems that powered entire regions. Advancement was slow but steady, and many workers entered the company in their early 20s, expecting to retire there decades later. Sons followed fathers, brothers worked side by side, neighbors shared shifts. Entire families built their lives around the assumption that Westinghouse would always be there. For a long time, nothing challenged that assumption. Electricity spread rapidly across the country. Cities expanded. Industry demanded more power. Rail systems electrified. Streetcars replaced horses. Factories increased output. The machines built inside Westinghouse plants became essential infrastructure, not optional equipment. Power plants relied on them. Transit systems depended on them. Hospitals, water systems, and communication networks all depended on stable electrical supply. Inside the factories, precision mattered above all else. Machinists worked to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Electricians wired control systems that regulated enormous currents. Engineers tested equipment under extreme conditions, simulating years of vibration, heat, and electrical load before a machine ever left the building. A single defect could shut down a power station, cripple a transit system, or cause cascading failures across an entire grid. The work was loud, hot, and relentless. Metal rang constantly. Motors hummed without pause. Cranes moved overhead, carrying loads that demanded complete attention. Sparks flew. Heat radiated from machinery. The air smelled of oil, insulation, ozone, and metal dust. These were places built for motion and noise, not quiet efficiency. The buildings themselves reflected long-term confidence. Brick walls were thick. Concrete floors were reinforced to handle extreme weight. Windows were tall to provide daylight before artificial lighting became fully reliable. Layouts were deliberate and rational, designed around efficient movement of materials and people. Everything about these spaces assumed continuity. George Westinghouse's philosophy shaped that confidence. He believed electricity would only succeed if it could be standardized and transmitted reliably over long distances. That belief placed the company at the center of a technical struggle that quietly determined the future of power distribution. Different systems competed to define how electricity would move from generators to homes and factories. One approach favored localized generation and short-distance transmission. Another favored centralized power plants and long-distance distribution. The choice affected how cities would grow, where factories would be built, and how infrastructure would develop. The system that ultimately spread favored distance and scale. Power plants could now serve entire regions instead of a few city blocks. Cities expanded outward. Factories no longer needed to sit beside generators. The electrical grid took the form it still has today. As that grid expanded, Westinghouse expanded with it. Factories grew larger, equipment grew heavier, projects became more complex. Each new generation of machines required more space, more specialized labor, and more capital investment. The company responded by building bigger rather than smaller, reinforcing the belief that scale itself was strength. For much of the early 20th century, that belief appeared justified. Westinghouse equipment powered steel mills, shipyards, subways, streetcars, and factories across the country. When cities modernized, Westinghouse was often involved. When new infrastructure was built, its machines were installed. The company's name became synonymous with reliability and permanence. But reliability depends on conditions remaining stable. As decades passed, the electrical industry matured. Early breakthroughs slowed, and innovation became incremental rather than revolutionary. Competition increased as new manufacturers entered the market, many of them focusing on narrower product lines or smaller components. Pricing pressure intensified, and profit margins narrowed. Westinghouse remained deeply invested in large-scale manufacturing. Its factories were optimized for producing massive, custom-built equipment. That specialization had once been an advantage, allowing the company to handle projects others could not. Over time, it became a constraint. These facilities were expensive to operate, difficult to modify, and poorly suited to rapid shifts in demand. At the same time, the global economy was changing. Manufacturing expanded overseas. New facilities were built with modern layouts and lower operating costs. American factories aged. Retrofitting massive industrial buildings became expensive and disruptive, while maintaining them required constant capital investment. Inside Westinghouse plants, the changes appeared gradually. Production schedules began to stretch, and departments that once operated independently were quietly consolidated. Equipment sat idle longer between runs, sometimes for days at a time, while maintenance was increasingly postponed or handled with temporary fixes rather than permanent solutions. The steady rhythm that had once defined continuous production did not collapse all at once, but it weakened in ways that workers noticed almost immediately. Workers were the first to feel the shift. Overtime disappeared, hiring slowed, younger workers were brought in less frequently, while older employees held onto their positions with a growing sense of uncertainty. Conversations on factory floors changed. Confidence gave way to caution. The assumption that the work would always be there began to feel less certain. Communities felt the effects soon after. Westinghouse factories were economic anchors. When shifts were reduced, local businesses suffered. Restaurants closed earlier, shops lost customers, housing values declined, municipal budgets tightened, schools lost funding. The consequences spread outward, affecting people who had never worked inside the factories. Still, the buildings remained. Their size made them difficult to abandon and difficult to replace. Entire neighborhoods depended on them. Closing them outright felt unthinkable, at least at first. They stood as physical reminders of past certainty. As the 20th century progressed, pressures continued to build. Energy markets shifted. New technologies changed how power was generated and controlled. Smaller, modular systems gained favor. Digital controls replaced mechanical ones. The massive equipment that once defined the industry became less central. Westinghouse responded by expanding into new sectors. Broadcasting, consumer electronics, nuclear power, and financial ventures became part of the company's portfolio. These moves brought revenue, but also complexity. Managing media networks required different priorities than running heavy manufacturing, and focus became increasingly divided. Meanwhile, the factories continued to age. Some were partially modernized, others were left largely unchanged. Investment increasingly flowed toward restructuring rather than infrastructure. Buildings that once symbolized confidence now required constant justification to remain open. Eventually, production slowed to a halt, not all at once and not dramatically. One department at a time, one shift at a time. Equipment was removed or sold. Workers were laid off in stages. Entire sections of buildings were locked and left behind. What remained were shells. Abandoned Westinghouse factories still stand in many places. Brick facades stretch for blocks. Rusted signage fades above sealed entrances. Windows are broken or boarded. Inside, dust coats control panels that once regulated power flowing to entire cities. Walking through these spaces feels unsettling. Blueprints still hang on walls. Safety instructions remain posted. Heavy machines sit exactly where workers left them. Overhead cranes remain frozen in place. The silence feels heavy and unnatural. These were places built for noise, heat, and motion. Without it, they feel wrong. The loss was not only economic. The skills developed inside those buildings had taken decades to accumulate. Machinists trained on specialized equipment found few places to use that knowledge. Engineers experienced in large-scale systems watched their expertise lose relevance. Communities built around the factories were forced to adapt without clear alternatives. Some buildings were repurposed, others were demolished. Many remain in limbo, too large to redevelop easily and too expensive to restore. They stand as reminders of an era when American industry believed scale guaranteed endurance. Only near the end does the pattern become clear. The same infrastructure that once enabled progress became difficult to sustain as conditions changed. Systems built for permanence struggled to adapt. Communities that tied their future to a single employer inherited that risk. Westinghouse helped electrify America. Its factories powered cities, industries, and daily life. But the world those factories were built for no longer exists. What remains are buildings, memories, and unanswered questions about how something so essential could fade so quietly. That is the tragic story behind the Westinghouse factories, not because they failed suddenly, but because they were built to last forever. This is only one of many places that shaped everyday life and then faded away. Subscribe to the channel to see what story comes next.